the question, what about having a strong man who can cut through? Then you began to get quite considerable numbers. And this is true in the United States, in Germany, in Canada, in Sweden. And the figures are actually higher in places like Canada and Sweden than they are even in the United States. So we have, I think when we think about Donald Trump, one of the things I argue against much of the analysis is when you have a problem that is bigger than America, you can't have an America-specific explanation. We are living through a global crisis of democracy. We are seeing the rise of Trump-like parties across the world and Trump-like figures. The United States, we would have thought, was more resistant. And it's true, there was a little bit of a lucky bounce that brought a Trump-like figure to power here. But a Trump-like party has the second most seats in the Parliament of the Netherlands. The National Front in France doubled its vote share between 2002 and 2017. You have a far-right party in the German Bundestag for the first time since the last time a far-right party had power in the German Bundestag. That's not good. And we have actual parties like this actually in power in Poland, Hungary, and other places.
So you're saying even if Trump hadn't gotten elected, that this phenomenon would be happening across the world?
We need to understand that something is going wrong in democratic life, and sometimes it shows itself in different countries in the party of the right, and sometimes in the party of the left. Let me say one more thing about party competition, because mercifully, Americans are living longer and longer, or at least those who are educated and affluent are living longer and staying active longer and longer. But the price of that is we have important parts of our citizenry are carrying around political ideas from 20 and 30 years before and applying it to a country that has changed. For much of the post-war period, every democracy had a party of the right and the party of the left, and but they would have one big one. And the party of the right was the party of, and the party of the left was the party of people who worked for wages, people who had more debts than assets, people who worked in the public sector. The party of the right was the party of the opposite, people who worked for salaries or dividends, people who had more assets than debts, people who worked in the private sector. True. German Christian Democrats, British Conservatives, Australian Liberals, Canadian Progressive Conservatives, American Republicans. It was the same map. Today, we see around the world that that is no longer how you predict how people vote. That what predicts how people voted is whether the voters' grandparents belonged to the local ethnic majority or whether they belonged not to the local ethnic majority. And beyond that, then they can have almost any. I mean, you have Democrats now in the United States who have views that are indistinguishable from the economic views of a Reagan-era Republican, but they have the wrong grandparents.
Yeah. You think, would Ronald Reagan recognize this Republican Party?
He would recognize it has a family. What you do is you take certain aspects of his party and you exaggerate them. And you take other aspects of his party and eliminate them. And yes, there's a family resemblance in the way that, a particularly disappointing great-grandchild has a family resemblance.
But as you said earlier, having a president, or maybe I heard you earlier on the radio, forgive me if that's what it was, the notion that we have a president who may be in collusion in some way with Russia, there was no part of the Republican Party that believed that or would have accepted that when Ronald Reagan was around.
Well, there was no part of any party. I mean, one reason I date the beginning of the decline in our institutions, I date it very intensely from the beginning of this century and the ill feeling over the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court decision. But I think I would really start the story at the end of the Cold War, because the discipline of the Cold War there are just things, so long as the country faced a truly existential foreign threat, there are things you didn't do. I mean, in 1988, if any politician were found to have had corrupt dealings with the Soviet Union, it would have been, it's unthinkable. It would have been explosive. It would have been an explosive thing. The country no longer feels it has that kind of existential threat from a major geopolitical round. It's very afraid of the external world. More afraid maybe than ever, but there's not some singular competitor that Americans are afraid of as a military threat. They fear China as an economic rival. They fear Russia's ability to make mischief. They fear terrorism from originating in parts of the Islamic world.
Tampering with our democracy?
But the inhibition against working with a foreign power, that has obviously changed. And I still find it obviously very shocking, and it's the single most shocking thing about the whole election. But that is one of the things that is one of the norms that is weakened. One final point I make this is a point I make in the book, that the founders of the country at the Constitutional Convention were very worried about foreign sway over the president. It was debated in Madison's notes that impeachment comes up twice with reference to the case of Charles II, who was King of England 100 years before the American Revolution, and who took bribes from Louis XIV of France, and who altered English foreign policy in order to keep the bribes. And they had his example in mind because they were creating a country that was smaller, weaker, and poorer than the other great powers that were present in this hemisphere, Spain, France, and England.
No. Let's take some audience questions here. In order to get back on track to restore democratic norms and checks, what is the most important step needed to be taken in the 2018 election?
I think we need to I would say there are two things. We need to get absolutely to the bottom of the foreign influence in the 2016 election. We need to have some agreed plans for how to prevent that from happening in 2020. It will happen in 2018. No one's on guard, and why wouldn't the Russians do it again? And we need, I say this with some sadness, but some things that had always been understandings have to be formalized. And we're going to need a law requiring the president to release his tax returns, the vice president. Actually, it should be the major party. The moment you accept Secret Service protection, you should have to release your tax returns. That seems a fair trade. You know, taxpayers paying to your safety.
What would you, where would you place the odds of a Republican Congress passing that?
I think it will pass sometime in the next one or two administrations, and I think by that point, I think the Republican Party is going to be a very different. I think it's going to go through a lot of pain and a lot of disgrace, and I think what's going to come. I think we're going to have a very different party system in general. Here's a way to think about this. It was in a room of people of some historical memory. Imagine someone standing on a timeline with 1990 as the center year, and they move 25 years to the right to 2015, and they wake up under the Rip Van Winkle doze, and they say who's running for president, and they're told Bush and Clinton. And what are they talking about? Iraq and healthcare. What are people worried about? The deficit. Nothing's changed. The country's changed. I mean, there's no internet in 1990. China is a poor country in 1990, but the political system has been frozen. Now you do the same thing going backwards 25 years from 1990. You're in 1965. The cities are on fire. The most powerful man in Washington is the head of the AFL-CIO. They're Southern segregationist Democrats. They're conservative. They're liberal Republicans. It's a different world. I think what happened between 65 and 90 in a dynamic country like this is normal. And what happened between 1990 and 2015 in this country is aberrant. And I think the politics, I think if you go 10 years from 2015, it's going to be a very different kind of landscape. And the parties are going to look much more different from their previous selves than they've looked over the past quarter century.
Better or worse?
Different. They're going to attract different kinds of constituencies, and different in ways that are hard to predict. I mean, if the Democratic Party continues to move as far to the economic left as it's moved in the past years, I mean, you may see this idea that remember I said there were a lot of economic conservatives whose grandparents were not part of the local ethnic majority who are in the Democratic Party for that reason. It may be that they leave anyway, and they put up with bad manners from the Republicans because at least the Republicans are not going to impose a wealth tax on them. Yeah. I don't know. And a lot of it depends on how we handle it. One last thing about that. I'm very much not in the prediction business, and not just because I predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the election, but because making predictions requires you to think it requires you to believe that the future is fixed. And this is a moment when the future is more plastic and depends more on good or bad decisions that individuals make than at any point I can remember. So don't make predictions, make the future.
Yeah. You mentioned the carbon tax earlier when we were talking about the tax bill. And of course, President Obama signed the Paris Accords. Trump has been critical of those, wants to pull out of those. May have already pulled out of those. Maybe he's just, he's also undoing a lot of the regulations. I think the tax bill removes tax credits for green energy, all kinds of things that many people who believe in data and science would say are taking the country in the wrong direction. What's your speculation about why, assuming, there's a lot of climate change deniers, and there's some who just vote for various things for some reason or another. Their donors want them to. I don't know what your position is on climate change, but you could argue that that is an existential threat, not just to the United States, but to the world. And so these private conversations that Republicans have over martinis or whatever, what do they think about that future?
Well, let's remember the international climate negotiation process began under President George H.W. Bush. The first important round of conversations that took place on the subject occurred during the Bush administration. The first world leader to speak seriously about this issue was Margaret Thatcher back in the middle 1980s. So the climate change issue is an example of how one of the ways that the American political system goes wrong, which is you take issues that are outside the historic thing that parties are arguing about, and that they become seized as shibboleths by one party or another, and they become party touchdowns, and then they become a way of organizing the party system, even though they don't have to be. And there's often a lot of randomness about that. There's often a lot of corruption, that somebody who has an interest in this issue will pay a certain number of decisive actors, not members of Congress, but people just outside, and they then inscribe this element into party dogma. And there are democratic versions of this as well. And so the problem is not just that that we tend to ignore facts. Democrats have their own versions of that, but that we live in a system of what a political scientist has aptly called a system of weak parties but strong partisanship. So that people let their party feelings dictate their beliefs about a lot of issues that have nothing to do with party politics.
But again, I mean, there are consequences for those things. You know, I mean, we're here now in California. The wildfire season is pretty much year round.
Yeah.
Floods, wildfires. You know, there's all kinds of weird weather going on. So there are consequences. I mean, so
there are real consequences.
So I mean, aside from it goes beyond partisanship, right? I mean, it affects people's lives.
Yeah. No, look, it's a subject I worry about a lot, and I worry especially afterwards. There are two books, one on the 17th century, one on the end of the Roman Empire, that deal with these climate issues that both make their own this point. That the most important and most alarming question about climate change is not is it man-made, but does it happen fast or slow? And most of the climate models assume that what happens is you have a gradual path, and what has actually happened in past periods when the world's climate, now in both of these cases for natural reasons, in the 1590s the world got suddenly dramatically colder, and so it did in the 540s. And in both those, you had huge civilizational consequences just because the change happened faster than the societies of the time could cope. And we have more resilience because we're more technologically advanced. We also have a lot more people on this planet, and many of them in very marginal situations. So yes, this is the president, and to have a president who doesn't think seriously about things is a problem. It's a problem for our foreign policy.
But it's not just the president. I mean, you know, the whole war on coal. We've been hearing about that for 8 years, 10 years,
Well, the war,
16 years.
The war on coal is very driven by regional politics. It's worth keeping in mind that the entire coal industry, not the miners, but the bookkeepers, everybody, the total employment of the coal industry is less than the total number of registered yoga instructors in the United States. But they're very important in the upper Midwest. And so it's kind of like an ethanol in reverse.
My favorite phrase from the President's State of the Union speech was clean, beautiful coal.
But also, the thing to remember there, and this is one of the things, is that's Donald Trump. I mean, he just also has this habit of, if I know that large numbers of people that I don't like care about something, I'm just going to go break it. And not because I cared about that thing myself 10 minutes ago. I just like to break things that people care about. I like to hurt people. And, you know, that you'll remember that exchange he had with Andrew McCabe, where he said at the end, oh, by the way, how does it feel that your wife is such a political loser? That's just, that desire to give pain gratuitously is such an important part of his personality.
Don't you think he'll get his?
I'm not so worried about, I have bigger fish to fry. I don't know. Also, I think one of the things about bad people is they're also always pathetic people. And when and if, and I'm not making any comment about the president, but when and if in general, when bad people get their comeuppance, it's always sad to see. And that's one of the reasons it's important just to keep them away from power. Because what you don't want to do is have, like, you know, if we all got our desserts, who among us would escape whipping, as Shakespeare. You know, we're all very flawed. What you want to do is make sure that the people in power are conscientious people with a view to history, and they're bounded by systems, because even the best people will abuse power.
All right, let's take some more questions from the audience. You folks have a lot of questions, by the way. That's good. What role do you think Fox and the far-right media and far-right evangelicals play in conditioning the GOP base to Trumpocracy?
Media systems have been tremendously important. I talk a lot about that. Donald Trump began, along the way, Donald Trump broke Fox. They began by treating him as kind of a joker. They played him for ratings, but at the first debate, you'll remember, they sent up their three most professional journalists, Chris Wallace, Megyn Kelly, and Bret Baier, to ask Donald Trump very tough questions. You read the transcripts, those are tough, embarrassing questions. And he went wild with rage, concentrated his rage on the woman, as he is characteristic to do, although Wallace's and Baier's questions were just as searching as Megyn Kelly's. And Fox discovered what the Republican Party discovered, which is that their base liked Donald Trump better than it liked their talent. And he brought them to heel. I mean, that's, as I said, when you do not underestimate his will to power, don't let Michael Wolff mislead you about that.
All right, here's another question. I'm going to skip the first part of that question. Has anything changed or evolved with regards to your conservatism? More compassion? Any more liberal thoughts? She said, hopefully, in parentheses.
I don't think you should assume. You know, there's a lot of research on how conservatives, this is pre-Trump, give more money to charity than liberals do. I don't think you should assume that.
They also have more money.
No, they're more religious. They're more religious. That's the difference. Liberals are more educated. No, it's religious affiliation that makes the difference. So I just don't think that one should pat oneself on the back so hard. So yeah, I mean, I've changed my mind about a lot of issues over my lifetime, and I've tried, for those who are interested, to give accountings for it when I have, and I've written about it on my website. If you care, there's a button called Second Thoughts where you can read. I've got about a dozen collected essays where I've written about things I've changed my mind about. But what I think is more to the thing that I am more conscious of is that the world changes. I mean, you'd better change your views about things, because they keep changing the exam questions. And if you give the same answers, you're going to be worse. You're just going to be irrelevant. You're not going to be able to be of any use to anybody.
All right, another question. What advice can you offer for never Trump Republicans who are swimming against the tide of their party and who want the GOP to return to conservative first principles?
Keep the faith. Your party needs you. And first, remember why you are a conservative and a Republican. And second, remember this, that it's no good at all for a political system to have one party that accepts democratic norms and one that isn't so sure. You need two. And people who are committed to democratic norms should go where they are most needed, and where they are most needed is inside the Republican Party.
You think I get emails from John Kasich, not personal emails, but you know, his organization, several times a week. He's letting me know what he's up to. Thanks, yes. Appreciate that, Governor. What is he up to? And do you think there's a chance that a Republican such as John Kasich will challenge Donald Trump if he's in fact running for re-election?
He's obviously contemplating a primary challenge. I don't think two-term governors of states launch themselves into quixotic adventures. So I think he's also taking the temperature on whether it would go somewhere. I think Mitt Romney, who looks like he will run for what may be an open Senate seat, is getting ready to be. I think we will see some of these voices.
Jeff Flake.
Jeff Flake, and whatever he does now, he may be a 2020 primary challenger. I think people will be heard from. At this point, they're all exploring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Crisis time for our democracy. Do you see a role for all living ex-presidents to speak out as a bipartisan body? We saw that extraordinary day a few months ago with both W and Obama speaking on the same day. I'm sure that wasn't a coincidence.
That is not a coincidence. So Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush are, I mean, Jimmy Carter's in great health. George H.W. Bush is in bad health, but they're both obviously, you know, in the later phases of life. For the three presidents who may be with us for a while, I'm going to put in a little commercial for my old boss. It's an interesting thing that the Bush-Clinton relationship is extremely cordial. Is truly friendly. They're true friends, and the Bush-Obama relationship is extremely cordial.
With W or?
With W. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the three younger presidents. Yeah. The Clinton-Obama relationship is more complicated. And so...
Who's that on? Never mind.
All complicated. One of the themes I think that is, I'm not hugely interested in questions like whose fault is it or who's right, because especially, I mean, it's on both. It's on, it's just a fact you have to integrate into your thinking. So George Bush's role here is especially crucial because he is the pivot, the intermediary, the person who can actually say to Clinton and Obama, this is a time when three need to speak out. I don't think either of those two could ever have that kind of impact. So the W. Bush, you know, it's not possible. He may not have played the last act in his political career.
Yeah, it is interesting how former presidents, I mean, they are members of a very small club, and they do seem to bond in some ways. And it seems like that's yet another norm that Donald Trump is blowing up.
They also receive a redacted version of the president's daily intelligence brief. And so while they don't see quite what the president sees, that ex-presidents know a lot about the dangers the country faces. And they retain deep relationships. And I believe they all own phones.
Yeah. You mentioned, of course, your old boss, George W. Bush. And it is interesting to hear so many Democrats thinking about him nostalgically.
Well,
not to mention Reagan and Nixon.
Yeah.
But you, as we said at the very beginning, helped coin the phrase axis of evil. Was it Iran, North Korea, and Iraq, I think, were the three. That became part of the pretext for the war in Iraq. Do you have any regrets about that?
I've written about this a lot, and I have complicated feelings about it because obviously the war was not a success.
Was it a mistake, though? Could it have been a mistake? Could it have been a success?
Could it have been a success? Let me put it this way. Once you discover, since the reason for the war was to stop Iraq from getting a nuclear weapon, it could not have been a success because you would not be able to fulfill the stated purpose of the war. But I believe that was a good faith mistake, certainly on the part of President George W. Bush. He sincerely believed it. I certainly believed it. Everyone I knew sincerely believed it. Could it have been a success if George W. Bush had said, okay, we're going to send 500,000 men from the very start, we're going to make the kind of investment in Iraq, then Iraq might have had more of a chance, but the United States would never have done that. That if confronted with the true project, I don't think the country would have agreed to do it. So it began on a term where there was a threat, and then there was a false idea about how easy this would be, and so it careened into failure. On the other hand, I have to look back and say, and this is a subject that obsesses me in my political thinking, there's always the other door, and you don't know what's down that other door. Down the other door is the United States does not invade Iraq. The price of oil goes up in 2005. Saddam Hussein, who was poor from 1995 to 2005, becomes very rich again. What does he do with that? All of those oil up to 1995, he's an incredibly aggressive, and the sanctions regime is crumbling. There were not going to be sanctions on Iraq for very much longer. The important sanctions were gone. And the whole Arab Middle East is in the throes of this Malthusian crisis, populations doubling, no work, water running out, the climate changing in ways that are adverse to them. Like, as in Syria, we have the 3 worst harvests in Syrian history in the 3 of the 5 years before the Syrian civil war breaks out. Iraq's even drier than Syria. What's down the other door? We can never know.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we face some really attractive options there. One last thing about it. It wasn't like we were at peace with Iraq. We had been at war with Iraq nonstop since 1990. We had an armistice. But the second biggest use of American air power since the end of the Cold War is Bill Clinton's air campaign in Iraq in 1998. Had Al Gore been elected, I don't think you would have seen American ground forces in Iraq, but you would have seen more rounds of aerial combat with Iraq.
I mean, we don't talk about this much longer, but Iraq was also the major check on Iran.
I don't think that was going to, but Iraq, I think Iraq was heading on a path because the place was going to blow up one way or the other. I don't know that it was only a check on Iran so long as the Saddam Hussein regime not only held together but deployed real military power.
All right, so let's see, we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. In today's Atlantic, there is a call to boycott the Republican Party.
Yes.
I haven't read the article, but what are your thoughts?
I read the article. So it's written by two people, Jonathan Rauch and Ben Wittes. Jonathan Rauch has been one of my closest friends since 1978, and Ben Wittes is a very good friend. So I read attentively and with enormous respect everything they say. I think the article would have benefited from the omission of some words because they wrote the article not just about federal politics, but also about state politics. And while there have been, I think that I write in the book, I'm very concerned about the Republican despair leading many state Republican parties to engage in voter suppression. I think the United States also has, I mean, in its most dynamic, most advanced, most important, he said, sucking up to the hometown crowd state, you would benefit from two-party politics in California.
But I have to say, I know you don't like to say whose fault is it, but I mean, yes, I would
doesn't matter
agree
whose
with
fault
that.
it is. Who loses? It's not the Republican Party that is the loser from the absence of two-party competition in California. It's the voter and taxpayer and citizen of California. Because what happens when you don't have two-party politics, of course, is you get factional politics. And factional politics are almost always less productive than two-party politics.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay, we'll leave that there. I regret we didn't have more time to talk about immigration because that's a big part of all that. Let's see, maybe I can slip in one or two more. Has the Republican Party lost its sense of patriotism?
I think the Republican Party is a lot of people in a lot of places. I would say that obviously Donald Trump cares about nobody but himself, and that is true about his family, and they are willing to pay a very, very high moral price for the presidency. Confronting that, they have put a lot of Republicans in a patriotic quandary. Some people have very eagerly jumped after Donald Trump. Some people have been dragged after him. I don't want to impugn any large group of people, but we need to reestablish the strong principle that it is absolutely unacceptable to work with a hostile foreign intelligence agency, without being, by the way, extremely, because it's obviously been true that America's friends have opinions about America's elections. I mean, the French and Germans, Gerhard, I should speak of the people. I mean, Schroeder and Chirac made no secret in 2004 that they could not wait to see the back of George W. Bush. Benjamin Netanyahu obviously preferred Mitt Romney over Obama in 2012. That's inevitable. And so long as this is done through non-clandestine means, it's a normal part. I mean, actually, you kind of want to know. I appreciate knowing which president is going to be more welcomed by America's friends. Yeah. I think that's useful information for me as a voter. If they carry out a campaign of disinformation and corruption in American soil, that's a different matter. But and that is what is unique. But I don't want to suggest that it's inherently wrong for foreign governments, especially our friends, to make clear that they have views. Of course, they have views.
Well, we've reached that point in our program. We have one last question. I want to give you an opportunity to leave it on a hopeful note. And in fact, I think the last chapter of your book is titled Hope. Where do you find it?
Well, let me start in this room. That the level of civic engagement we have seen across the United States in the past year, 2014 is the lowest turnout election since 1942, when millions of American men were overseas. 2016 was an election conducted in a strong mood of looking for the lesser of two evils. I was really worried when Donald Trump took office, that what we would see is that 2017 would be a year of Occupy Wall Street times 1,000. Unproductive gesture politics aimed at speaking to tiny little factional segments of American life, flag burning, carrying the Mexican flag at demonstrations. Instead, what we have seen is people buying subscriptions to the New York Times, the the Washington Post, to the Atlantic. Our readership is up.
NPR,
NPR. People seek understanding the danger of disinformation and responding it by not taking the outside. Well, I'll read. There's a lot of liberal leaning and disinformation on them. No, I'm going to go to the source. I want quality information about public affairs. That's tremendously heartening. I find it heartening that so many people are so shocked by the president's lying, and not just his big purposeful lies, but by his casual lies. Mighty is truth and destined to prevail is the old Latin saying, and I think a lot of Americans are asserting that for themselves. I see encouragement in our willingness to pay attention to a lot of issues that got short shrift in 2015, the drug epidemic, what is happening to the economic prospects of Americans between the two wealthy coasts, and even on the wealthy coast, not everyone is doing so well. I mean, we tended to lose sight of that in some past moments. That's at the center of the national conversation again, where it needs to be. I think the discovery of so many American allies who have often chafed at American world leadership that they like it less when America is absent. The discovery among people on the political left who would once have made heroes of the Julian Assanges and the Edward Snowdens, that threats come not only in the form of tanks and rockets, but also in clandestine forms, and you need the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA to do their work.